Magandang hapon, ako po si Alan Vera, isang guro sa Department of Community Development. Ang paksa na pinakausap na ibahagi ko ngayon sa inyo ay disaster risk reduction. Karamihan sa aking ibabahagi ay mga aral na natutunan ko mula sa pagtatrabaho sa isang international NGO. Ito ay mula sa aking pag-usap sa mga vulnerableng komunidad, ang kanilang mga organisasyon, mga non-government organizations na tumutulong sa mga komunidad na ito, o kaya nagsusulong ng reforma sa mga pulisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at mga ah, pamahalang lokal kung saan madalas ay nakakaranas ng mga disasters. However, the learning does not stop there. We still do not know a lot about disasters, disaster risks, and what to do to reduce these risks. Each disaster is unique, and it will be a shame to experience a disaster without learning anything from it. Last year, I also gave an input in NSTP on DRR. One of the exercises I asked uh, students to do was to draft a contingency plan if a lockdown was imposed inside the University of the Philippines. Nagtaas bigla ang mga kamay, mga estudyante. Sir, ano bang lockdown? Only 1 year has passed, pero sa tingin ko, kapag ginawa ko ulit yung ganong klaseng exercise, wala na magtatanong kung ano ang lockdown. While we try to anticipate disasters and try to reduce the risks, we must always continue to learn and strengthen our capacities as individuals, as institutions, and as communities to survive, to respond, and to thrive during disasters. But first, a quick question. Why does the Philippines rank third in the World Risk Report? A, the Philippines is in the Pacific Ring of Fire. B, the Philippines has poor disaster-related policies and governance. C, the Filipinos are not aware of the disaster risks and are undisciplined in following safety protocols, mga pasaway. D, all of the above. E, none of the above, siret na. As we learned in grade school, the Philippines is in the Pacific Ring of Fire, a zone of high volcanic and seismic activity which covers 40,000 kilometers. As such, we are exposed to volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and the secondary hazards that are associated with these, such as ashfall, lahar, ground shaking, rupture, liquefaction, tsunami, landslides, etc. Let's now show the evolution of the Philippines geographically. This slide shows the current map of the country. The number at the upper right-hand corner is the date in terms of million years ago. This is what it looks like 50 million years ago. Whew. Exciting and terrifying. Several takeaways from this. First, our land moved and it has not stopped moving. We are children of earthquakes. Second, our high biodiversity is a product of the diversity of our terrain. Some land masses became connected, some were previously connected and then became separated. The tarsier was thought to be just present in Bohol but was later to be found in various parts of Surigao del Norte. Third takeaway, Palawan and Mindoro are more connected to the continental Asia. This explains why biodiversity in Palawan is different and probably why malaria is high in these two areas. Also, relatively no earthquakes are felt in Palawan, which is why it has a lower construction factor of safety. compared to other parts of the Philippines. It also means that very old land is present in Palawan and in this region, which is why natural gas and oil is more likely to be found in these disputed waters of the West Philippine Sea than any other part of the country. But aside from being in the Pacific Ring of Fire, this map, which tracks all tropical storms, shows that we also serve as the welcoming committee for continental Asia for typhoons that build from the Great Pacific Ocean. This is a natural hazards profile of the Philippines. It not only shows that the country is exposed to many hazards, it also reveals that a large part of the country is prone to multiple hazards. This makes it difficult to comprehend recommendations by experts and government to relocate households away from danger zones to safe zones. Saan nga ba talaga dito ang safe zone? And while there are a lot of disaster risk reduction programs being conducted by government, the United Nations, international and national non-government organizations for natural hazards, what is barely being addressed are human-induced hazards. Hazards that are born out of conflict, policies, economic and industrial development, neglect, discrimination, etc. Human-induced hazards actually outnumber natural hazards and are becoming more frequent, not just in the Philippines, but in Southeast Asia. And yet, DRR projects focus mostly in natural hazards. 3 years after Typhoon Yolanda, international humanitarian agencies have already packed up after the response and rehabilitation projects have already ended. But 3 years after the Marawi siege, the residents of Marawi have not yet been allowed to return to their homes, to rebuild their houses, as they wait for government forces to locate and detonate the bombs that they themselves dropped on the city. Residents are being relocated to resettlement sites even if their houses are not located in natural hazard prone areas. So we ask, is being in the Pacific Ring of Fire the real reason why we are prone to disasters? So what is a risk? The traditional and dominant definition of risk is the likelihood of harm or loss or disaster. In equation form, this is risk is equal to likelihood and impact. And we can place that in a chart when we compute it. One axis would be likelihood, the other axis would be impact. And then we can classify hazards as low priority, medium priority, or high priority. So if it's a hazard that would frequently happen and it may involve a large number of people affected, it will be tagged as high priority and a lot of action would be done to address this hazard. This definition is highly focused on hazards. Conventional strategies are focused on reducing the likelihood and impact of the hazard, either through disaster preparedness and engineering solutions. That's it. The alternative definition of risk is when the vulnerable are exposed to the hazards. So risk is equal to hazard times exposure times vulnerability, where hazard is the historical and potential physical impact of a disturbance. It can be natural or human induced, as we have earlier discussed. Exposure is when the elements are affected by the hazard, and vulnerability, which are human, socioeconomic, and ecological susceptibility. So even if there is a hazard, if we are not exposed to it, we do not have a risk. If the typhoon will bring a lot of wind and rain, if we are far from its path, we are not at risk. If we are exposed to the floods, but we are in the 10th floor of a condominium, we are not at risk of drowning. Even if big houses and shanties are both exposed to floods, the time needed to recover from the disaster is longer for the poor than those who are rich. So the potential impact of the disaster weighs heavily on the most vulnerable. But aside from unpacking what a disaster risk is, this alternative definition provides us more options on how to reduce disaster risks. We can focus on the hazard. We can try to mitigate it by providing engineering solutions. We can place a dike, we can build stronger houses, etc., so that the impact of the hazard will be reduced. We can focus on minimizing the exposure. We can evacuate during a time of a disaster. We can relocate to more less uh, hazard prone areas. Or we can focus on vulnerability. We can reduce the vulnerability. We can develop the capacities of people. We can improve disaster preparedness. We can develop the management of natural resources. We can protect the rights of the most vulnerable. We can even focus on the risk. We can transfer it to other institutions, which is what we actually do when we get an insurance. We give the risk to the insurance company so that just in case something happens, they would bear the cost. So now disaster risk reduction is not just limited to having engineering solutions or preparing communities. Now we have a lot more options when we do disaster risk reduction. A lot of it actually hinges in reducing the vulnerability of the poor. As an example on building disaster preparedness capacity, let's watch this video of how the Social Action Center of Northern Quezon enhanced the early warning system of people affected by the great floods in 2004 in Infantine, Real, Quezon.